My guest on this week's episode of Suds Search is Azeem Ahmad, aka Azeem Digital. Azeem is a veteran digital marketer, an international conference presenter, and the host of one of the most popular podcast series around, Azeem Digital Asks. Azeem is an outspoken advocate for diversity and inclusion initiatives, especially within our industry. To learn more, I highly recommend following him on Twitter at the handle @Azeem Digital and by subscribing to his newsletter, The Marginalized Marketer. I caught up with Azeem shortly after he delivered a presentation at Brighton SEO about how to get buy-in from your boss using ROI. I love this topic because it actually sounds like the job that marketers do. Developing persuasive skills using data is a great thing for young marketers to learn. I'll also ask him about his podcast. We'll talk about what makes a great show great. We'll discuss some of the amazing guests he's spoken to, and tune in to find out how the show got started in the first place. We'll chat about being a multi-channel digital marketer rather than a specialist. We'll spend some time talking about what it was like being back at a big in-person conference again. And I'll spend a little time chatting with him about how to overcome common objections when you are seeking buy-in from your boss. All right, Azeem, welcome to Suds Search. How you doing?
I am very well, Mark. Thank you very much for having me. How are you?
I'm doing great. I understand that you're doing this on a bank holiday there in the UK, so I appreciate you fitting us in. I know that can be tough on a day off.
Absolutely. One thing I didn't mention after recording, you might judge me for now. So over here in the UK, it's 8:34 p.m. This is dangerously close to Azeem's bedtime. So don't judge me.
I understand that very well. So that too, I appreciate you doing this late in the night there. So I want to start with the Azeem Asks podcast. I can see the shirt you're wearing there. It's a very popular podcast. You've gotten some great guests. Open-ended question. Tell our audience about the show, how you got started, and what they can expect if they go check it out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for bringing it up, first of all. So the Azeem Digital Asks podcast started a few years back in the first lockdown over in the UK. And the answer to that is probably sort of twofold. So the first part of that is I really miss the in-person aspect of conferences and certainly the networking. And I thought, right, how can I still hang out with my friends, but more importantly, how can I help others get some value from that? So that was like the first part of it, but the second part of that was before I started the podcast a few years ago, I had sort of dabbled in audio and podcast advertising, but for me, I've always been keen to sort of like look under the hood, understand how it all works. So I managed to place podcast ads, but I never understood how podcasts work and how to set them up. So I thought, right, well, I'm going to set one up and see what happens. I'm just going to record a chat with a couple of friends, put it out there, see what happens. And it started off and it was like, 30 people have listened to this. And I was like, oh my God, yes. Am I an influencer now? But in all seriousness, back to the point of the podcast. So the main reason was to network with people, to learn from people, and more importantly, as you've probably seen from my social feeds, I'm a huge advocate for diversity and inclusion, and I realised that there was a space in the marketing podcast industry, because there are millions of marketing podcasts. I don't know how many, but if you search marketing podcasts, you'll get tons there. In fact, as a test, don't do it now, but after listening, maybe type in something like best marketing podcast. Look at that carousel. It's probably full of white faces. So I thought there's an opportunity here for an ugly brown face to get involved, but also to help amplify the voices of people who I typically class as marginalised. So one thing that I always say is I don't really care if people have 3 followers or 300,000. If there's some value to be had from a conversation of up to 20 minutes, then let's make this happen. So yeah, that's the podcast. Please check it out.
Well, awesome. And I want to point people to your social media. I think you're a good Twitter follow for more of that stuff on the diversity and inclusion aspect. I think you're a good follow for all your contributions. And we'll make sure to link to that in the show notes. You know, I want to ask you about the medium itself, about podcasting itself. I don't know what it was. Maybe it's like you during COVID and the lockdowns. I got more into it. I certainly made friends with people like Jason Bernard was on this show. I love his podcast now. I check it out all the time. You know, but I have other interests too. Like sports are an interest of mine where I'm more into podcasts than I was before I had one, for sure. Again, a broad question about the medium itself. What do you think makes a podcast work? What do you think are the key components? What do you think, when you've had a really good show, what do you think were the ingredients that really worked?
So personally speaking, for me, depending on when this goes out, so my next episode, I never reveal the guests before they come out, by the way, but my next episode is all about content and how it's more just blogging. And it's a conversation where I don't say anything. So when I come to edit the podcast, I look at the sound waves, for example, if it's purely audio. And if my track has lots of waves in there, it's probably not a great episode. When there's little to none in there, and it's all about the guest and the value, I never try to add too much, because I think people come to the episode, certainly for my podcast, to listen to the guests. They haven't come for me.
Yep.
So it's important for me to not say a lot. So great episode is that. But more importantly for me, generally speaking, it's where you can passively listen and or watch and get value from it. So for example, more recently with my podcast, I've just started to introduce video to that, to understand whether people will visually consume it or is it just pure audio. And at the moment, open book, if you look on YouTube, the more recent episodes, I should say, are on there. Probably no more than 30 or 40 views. But if I look at the numbers on Spotify video, for example, those are increasing. A lot of my subscribers are on Spotify. So it's a no-brainer for me to put that on there. But I've digressed slightly. A great episode is where you can passively listen and get value from it. Sometimes I listen to podcasts that are maybe, 3 or 4 hours long. I can't tell you everything that's said in those 3 or 4 hours, but I can tell you the 4 or 5 key points and things that resonate with me. Especially when I'm working at home, I don't like silence. I'll put something on, like a podcast, and I listen away and work. Sometimes there'll be something that's said that's made me sort of stop what I'm doing and think, that's incredible. I need to go back and just hear that again so I can process it. And it's literally those moments that can take you away and you think that you've got value from it. So passively gain value from it, but more importantly, make you think, right, I want to go back and listen to this again and hear that again properly so I can fully understand what's being said. So the value is key there for me.
I love that. Well, I think another thing about you that's interesting is you're a well-rounded digital marketer. A lot of people we have on here are an expert at a really specific thing, like they're a local SEO or an expert on TikTok ads or something like that. I feel like I really benefited from, sort of out of necessity, I had to learn a lot of things early in my agency life. I just had to kind of dabble in a lot of things to see what would work. I wonder, do you think that your varied interests, that you kind of have a specialization in a lot of different things, has made you a better podcaster, has made you a better interviewer, because you're not so deep. You're generally interested in everything, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Even the things that I don't enjoy, or I find difficult. To be fair, the things that I find difficult, I probably spend a lot more time doing. But yeah, the areas of marketing that I don't enjoy, I will still get involved, because I guess for me, when I started, I think it probably worked in my favour. 2 things. My career started agency side, so I learned huge amounts very, very quickly. That's one thing I would never change. Starting in an agency, I would recommend that to anybody, because you have to hit that ground running. But more specifically, I started solely working only in PPC. All I ever knew was PPC and Google Ads. And very quickly, after a few years, and more out of my own sort of being inquisitive and looking and delving more into Google Analytics, I very quickly thought 2 things. Well, number one, PPC is not everything. People don't just think, oh, I'm going to search for this, click the ad and buy it. Right. The whole buyer journey is sort of fragmented and complex. And I thought, well, I need to understand as much of this as possible. And also, PPC may not be around forever. And at the time, sort of 7 or 8 years ago, there were lots and lots of PPC marketers. So I thought, well, how can I stand out? How can I diversify what I know? Because if this agency was to go boom tomorrow, my only skill set is in PPC, so I'm up against hundreds of people who know this. So I thought very quickly that I need to diversify. I need to learn about all these different channels, and I'm very fortunate that, well, I started agency side, and more importantly, one of my last clients, agency side, was a huge European auto manufacturer, and I learned quickly then that it's literally not just search. Or at the time when I left, I was playing in sort of paid search, paid social, those sort of areas, and a little bit of SEO is where I sort of started to get my interest in there. I realised very quickly, for example, when it comes to buying a car, there was a Google study that they released so many years ago saying it's something like, I don't know, 300 digital touch points over X amount of months. It's something that I'm doing now. I'm looking to buy a car. I'm looking at my own search behaviour afterwards, thinking, I feel for the people who have to run these marketing campaigns. But yeah, to answer your question,
Right.
I realised I had to diversify super quick. At the start, it was more out of interest. I needed to learn how all the pieces work together to understand the entire puzzle, not just look at one specific part of it. But then more importantly, I realised in order to get better at marketing, I needed to understand, I needed to break things, essentially, and I needed to get more analytical. I needed to spread myself thin. So if people ask me, am I an expert in local SEO? Absolutely not. Can I run a Google business profile page? Yeah, absolutely. I'm fortunate to have a wonderful friend called Claire Carlisle who will just phone up and say, look, I need some help with this. She can do that. But yeah, I wouldn't say I'm an expert in anything, not even podcasting. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert in anything, but the idea of me learning to spin several plates at once in order to become a better marketer certainly appeals to me, and that's how I got to where I am today.
Love it. Love it. Well, I want to ask you about Claire's appearance on your show. She's a friend of ours, and she was great. I listened to her episode before you came on here, but I worry sometimes. I love podcasting is my favorite part of my job, so sometimes I can go down a rabbit hole with another fellow podcaster. So I do want to ask you about your Brighton speech. So I reviewed the slides, and it was really, really well received. I mean, everybody on Twitter had good things to say for you. And before I get into the meat and potatoes of that speech, this was the first big conference back, right? At least for most people, for many people anyway. Since the pandemic, I didn't get to go. Our vice president of search, Greg Gifford, was there, spoke, but I had horrible FOMO. Like this looked really great. The pictures were amazing. Just give me your impressions of being back at an in-person live conference, to have a crowd. To be able to network with people and shake hands and all that stuff. What was it like?
Yeah, it was brilliant. So it was the first, in inverted speeches, proper one back, because there was one in the autumn, fall, but it was only for sort of UK people, unfortunately, due to the restrictions here. So it would have been either extremely expensive or difficult for any of our non-UK friends to come. But a lot of people were seeing the images from that conference, and we're like, oh, we can't wait for the summer. Hopefully things are better. And yeah, this one around was huge. It felt like a normal Brighton SEO. Lots of people, lots of engagement, and yeah, for a couple of days at least, and certainly sort of 20 minutes at a time during people's conference talks, it felt like things were sort of back to normal again, and that's a credit to everybody else who was speaking and attending, who made that conference and just made you switch off from the outside world temporarily, and just really geek out for a few days, which was really cool. So yeah, it was brilliant, and I've got no doubt that will continue to grow, hopefully positively throughout the year. There's another one later this year, and let's hope it's just as big, if not bigger, than the last.
Awesome. Well, the topic you presented on is how to get buy-in from your boss using ROI. I really like this topic, so I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions about it, and let's dive in. But the first thing that comes to mind is a question about bosses. There are different kinds of bosses. Some are some are bean counters. They're like, okay, if it doesn't work out in the P&L, then no. Some are aggressive. They're conquestors. They care about market share. I've had bosses that are still working in the business, and they would really like to just have relief from what they're doing. So, yeah, I guess when you're trying to get buy-in, do you think the approach should change based on where the boss sits in the C-suite or within the organization, do you think the way you approach them should change based on who they are?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, if we stick with the phrase boss, people will typically have one boss or a line manager, somebody that they report into. When we look at the C-suite or the boardroom, for example, I've worked in different sort of setups where marketing has a direct involvement with the CMO, obviously, but also with the CFO, for example. Now, the CFO will typically only care about dollar bills, pound signs. They don't care about things like CTR. To be fair, let me just take a side step for a second. I slag off CTR all the time because on its own I just don't think it means anything. So whenever I say something negative about a metric, I'll always pull out CTR because on its own it doesn't mean anything to me. Right, back in the room. CMOs will want to know about all that juicy stuff, clicks, impressions, how many people saw our ad, etc. CFO was literally be like, I've given you $1,000. How many are you bringing back to the company? If it's less, why? If it's more, what can you do with 2,000 or 10,000? So typically I would hope that attendees of the talk or anybody in marketing who would have come to that talk already has some sort of relationship with the C-suite. If they didn't, or if you listen to this and you don't have that relationship, it has to be via another person. Find a way to make that happen, even if it's just like, for example, if you're in the office and you're making a cup of tea, for example, very British thing, and you're having a chat at the kettle, just start talking about marketing. Start talking about, what are you up to today? What are your challenges today? What do you want to achieve today? And then it's not necessarily a marketer trying to be friendly and get in with the CFO. You're just literally showing an interest. For all you know, that CFO could be having the worst day ever. This is literally what I did. Jump into the kitchen and be like, when it gets to 5 p.m. today, what 3 things would you like to get out the door and why? And then it's just a nice break. Typically, this is very stereotypical, I should say. Monday mornings, everybody's like, oh, how's your weekend? And it's lovely to learn more about people, but you don't know if that person is saying the same story 4 or 5 times over, and by the 5th time, if that is you, it's literally just going to be like, oh, yeah. Right. I went to see my parents, went to the pub, had a few beers, here we are again. Or it could just be like, look, it's Monday, let's get to it. What do you want to get out of the door today? So to answer your question in a very long-winded way, start forging relationships with those people if you don't. If you do, start to leverage them to both of your advantage. If it's one-sided, then very soon you'll see that the quality of that relationship, I think, will start to diminish. So if you don't have one, build that relationship. If you do have one, start to leverage it to both of your advantage.
Yeah, that reciprocity is very important. Yeah. Okay, so let's say I've had an epiphany. I want to get buy-in from my boss. I've scheduled the big meeting. I'm now at my desk with a few spare hours to get my approach ready. What are the first 1 or 2 steps that I should be taking? Where do you start with this stuff?
Speaking purely from my own experience, I like to try and get involved in as much of the business numbers as I can. Generally speaking, in any business that tends to have a bad period or a bad patch, or the money is tight, more often than not, I was going to say 9 out of 10 times, but more often than not, marketing is the first place that gets that budget slashed. Well, we don't even need marketing, they just sit on Facebook all day. Again, very stereotypical views. I need to make sure, it's something that I'm literally just done now. I need to make sure that I'm adding value, not just in terms of making sure the graph goes up and to the right, but in terms of increasing the bottom line of the business, increasing the revenue for the business. So I need to say, right, last year the business made X. This is what the business actually spent on marketing. Typically, we could do a whole other episode on this, so I won't spend too long. Attribution, I don't think anybody has cracked yet. But I need to make sure that the people listening to what I'm about to say, because ultimately, the long and short of it is, I'm going into them to say, I would like £10,000, please. This is what I think it's going to return. It could be a 30-second meeting, but as a marketer, you've got to spice it up a little bit and say, look, this is what the business is going to give to me. This is what I hope to return back from it. So very often, I will say that in a 30-minute or a 1-hour meeting. I'll put some numbers in front. of the business and make sure that there's something in there in that presentation for every member of the boardroom, right down to the CEO. So I'll talk about, for example, leads was an example that I used in my presentation. I could talk about the quality of the lead, for example, and I can talk about how we're going to nurture that lead into a sale. For the CFO, as I mentioned earlier, just cold hard cash numbers. You give me X, I think I will give you Y. If it doesn't, then I'll tell you what happened and we can talk about it then. There might be unforeseen circumstances, seasonality, typically people say. For the CMO, I'll spend a lot more time talking about this is the person that I'm going to speak to, this is my audience, this is my customer profile, this is how we're going to do it. So we'll tailor it to each individual person. Hopefully be ready for any questions that come my way, but ultimately I will say, here's what I'd like to achieve. And one thing that I always do, and I don't think that I mentioned this in my presentation, but I will always go in. So let's say, what's the best way to describe this? I'll always present 3 opportunities. I will say, if we did nothing and stayed the same, here's what I think we'll achieve. If you increase what I've asked for by 10%, I think we can deliver this, and you can hold me to those numbers. If you're not comfortable with increasing what I'm asking for by 10%, how about you give me half of what I ask for, and then I'll deliver this. If you want, you can give me half for X amount of time. If that progress starts to track and I'm in line with where I would be if you doubled the investment, then we can double it. I never typically spend too long talking about the 50% because it's often the one that gets brought into, like, okay, we'll give you half and then let's go from there. But typically when you present it that way, sort of like a Dragon's Den style thing, we will just go to there and go from there.
I love it. Well, I think one of the things that's interesting about how you approach that is that you're going to forecast some things. You're going to say, if you do this, I expect that you'll have this sort of return, which is, I think, challenging. I think that can be hard, especially for a younger marketer. And it's a little bit courageous. You have to put your neck on the line for that result, and you have to follow through. You have to realize that some of these things are outside of your control. If there's a huge recession or if there's a new competitor comes into play, your forecast might be kaput. How do you get better forecasts? How do you make sure that you can be a man of your word or a woman of your word and make sure that you're actually delivering on what you say to the boss?
Yeah, that's a great question. So typically, more often than not, most marketers, including myself sometimes, will say, we'll look at historical data. For example, certainly in my situation, we've just done 2 CMS migrations. So one was in February, March time. So if I look at year on year, it's literally apples and oranges. And when we look at business reviews and whatever, typically the business will look at year on year. And in some cases, after a migration, traffic will decline. Like I said earlier about CTR, if we looked at that, and I've certainly had this conversation, we've lost X amount of traffic, what's going on? I'll say, yeah, we have, but look at every other metric, look at engagement, look at the depth of people's visits, look at what they're doing, look at conversions. Would you rather less overall people, but of a higher quality, better conversions, and more importantly, the sales numbers and volume has gone up, it's grown, and I haven't done a lot in specific areas of the website to increase sales. I've literally looked at the key areas of the old website that I want to keep, put them into the new one, and it's increasing sales. I've got a whole strategy panned out for the rest of the year, for the next 12 months. I'm barely in month 1 or 2, and it's growing. It's not going to be plain sailing. For example, there's some things where I've pushed out content we're ranking in the top spots for key queries within a couple of weeks. Now, I've been straightforward with the business and said it's not going to be like this for everything. I cannot put out a piece of content and rank in a couple of weeks for certain things, certainly like in the top spots, but I know there are areas where our competitors are weak. I've done this to demonstrate to you the value of the strategy that I'm putting in place. So if you buy into me in this strategy, I can help increase that for you. So, and when things go wrong, I think that, to answer your question, transparency is important. I've been in situations before and in teams before where people have sort of lied and BS'd to cover it up, but you'll always get found out. And you should never... People always will either lie or they will say, well, our competitors did this which we didn't know about. For me, that second one is just shouldn't fly with me. You shouldn't. Again, we could do another episode of this. You should never wait for your competitors to move before you move. Or equally, you shouldn't try and justify your own decisions for your business on whether your competitors have done it or not. The idea is to be the best at what you do, not the first. Because if it was just literally just a race to be first, then I think the whole industry in terms of quality would diminish rapidly. For example, digressing a little bit, I don't think I've mentioned this on my podcast recording before, but in fact it was a conversation that I had at Brighton, so I'm sidestepping a moment, bear with me. So at Brighton SEO, afterwards during the networking, there was an agency owner who came to me and he said, Azeem, I want to start a podcast. I've got this and this, like I spent thousands of pounds on equipment. What should I do? And then I went through, we had a whole long conversation about it, but I literally told this guy everything that I know about podcasting, the tools that I use, the software, the cost, how I edit, because the podcast is all me, nobody else does it for me. I do it outside of my work. Literally, I told this guy everything. At the end, he said to me, why have you told me all this? Like, you've literally given away everything. What's to stop me from making a podcast like yours, and potentially being better than you? And I said, I wouldn't have told you any of this if I didn't believe that every time I press start recording on a podcast that it's going to be a brilliant episode. If I at any point, like even before this episode tonight, I wouldn't have clicked join studio if I didn't think that there was going to be some value to be had from this episode. If I was not 100%, or I thought I'm going on to somebody else's podcast, I've got podcasts of my own, potentially I could damage two brands here, I would never click join studio if I didn't think that there would be some value to be had. In answer to your first question earlier, I think so far, hopefully, please tell me if that's the case, there is some value to be had. So yeah, very long-winded answer, you can tell I'm a podcaster, but you have to be honest, you have to be truthful, and you have to believe that the business, your client or the agency, whatever working environment you're in, you have to believe whenever you try and execute any part of anything that you're going to be really good at it. 100%.
Oh, amen. I agree with everything you were saying. A lot of head nodding. The other thing I didn't hear you mention, so you're going around the room, you're talking about ROI to this person, you're talking about market share to this person, and the audience segmentation to the CMO and everything like that. But the deliverables, when you're trying to get buy-in from a boss, how important is, how many pieces of content they're going to get, how many hours they're going to spend on link build, whatever the deliverable is. How do you approach that conversation with people who really mostly probably care about the result and the ROI? Where does the deliverable come in play?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is how I ended my talk at Brighton. So the last little section of the talk, I used a scale. It was from one of Simon Sinek's talks, where he was talking about how the Navy SEALs choose different members of their team, and it was literally performance and trust. So how I present this in terms of deliverables are, as I mentioned at the start, I look at channels not in isolation but together. So if you imagine, I'll send you a link to the slide so people can go and check them out, but essentially bottom left hand corner, lowest performing, lowest trust, typically everybody sort of avoids that channel. On the inverse, top right would be highest performing, highest trust. It's essentially called a unicorn. So in the Navy SEAL example, literally that person doesn't exist. In a marketing example, typically that wouldn't exist. On the lowest performing one, you could probably say something like display advertising on Google, where you either have or haven't bought inventory, or it's of very low quality. It's the digital equivalent of just licking your finger and putting it in the air and hoping for the best. Where I looked at and focused was on the right hand side, but in the middle to bottom. So high trust and low performing, or medium trust and high performing. High trust, medium performing. Essentially, the channels where you can look to get sustained long-term growth from. And one of the things that I do, and if you ever see any of my more recent slides, slide 2 or slide 3 will literally say the words widely applicable. When that comes up on the screen, I say to people, I make these talks as widely applicable as possible. What I won't do is say, here's a case study for a client where I've delivered X, Y, and Z, because I've been in the room and I've spoke after people who have done that, and it doesn't do anything other than stroke their own individual egos. I did a talk in October last year, literally about how to start a podcast. I used my own as an example, but I never said I've done this and this and here's how I've grown my podcast. I've literally said here's the tools, here's the equipment you need. So that's that. When it comes to cold hard numbers and deliverables, if I'm in that room, I'll say typically you invest X, I forecast that we will get Y. If the economy or the situation works in our favour, I think we could get this. If things decline, as they are, so without boring you too much or sidestepping, a lot of the things that I look at now involve wondering if the costs of shipping containers are going to, freight containers are going to go up or going to go down. That has an impact, to the point where I'm very fortunate that with my company we have even been into the stock factory to look at all the stock, look all the volume of stock there that hasn't actually gone out. In e-commerce, I think if anybody, I'm not an e-commerce expert, but I can point you to 3 or 4 people who are incredible. I think it's important for a marketer to literally go and look at all that stock, because those numbers in analytics you can get lost in. When you look at all that cold hard stock that needs to move, you have a reality. You see that there are people in there who work long, hard hours, all morning, all night, organising and moving that stock. That you cannot get out of analytics. I've digressed again, please shout at me. But in answer to your question, cold hard deliverables, I will say, I think if you give me this, give me X, I will give you Y. If I don't give you Y, we'll have regular check-ins and I'll tell you why that is not happening, why I haven't given you Y, if that makes sense. But I will always end the presentation with that, and I'll drop it in the middle and I'll drop it in the start, because ultimately, like I said when I talked about those kitchen conversations, those people in that room, it might be 3 or 4 p.m. At the end of the day, they might be physically in the room, or if it's digital, they might be there, but they might not be fully there. They might have got a lot of other considerations, to the point where I even did this in my Brighton SEO talk. So it was 4 p.m. on the second day, and I was fortunate enough that 4 p.m. on the first day I had a look around and I thought, right, I am going to give my talk at this time. Lots of people were sort of tired, waiting for the keynote. It was the sort of session where people were like, oh, it's a long day, 10 till practically 6 of networking. So I literally thought I need to get everybody engaged in the room, because my talk was the first one after a break. So I went on stage and I said to everyone, I've hidden a pink post-it note under one of your chairs. Very big thank you to my friend Andrew for this idea, but I said I've hidden a pink post-it note under one of your chairs. I need to get you all engaged. If you find that, you win a prize. Literally everybody went from like zombie mode to, right, it started panicking and everyone got moving. I was like, right, now I've got you all moving, I'm very sorry, that was a lie, but now I know you're engaged. Here's the talk that I'm going to give to you. And it seemed to go down well. But yeah, in answer to your question, cold hard numbers, I say here's what I'll deliver to you at the start, middle and end. And I don't use bullet points, because I know Greg is not a big fan of them.
Right.
But yeah, that's the point. That's the whole thing, basically, the whole shebang. Start, middle and end, and I will say hold me to them. If we can't, then I'll have a reason why. And if it's the truth that it's just not been good enough, like I said, transparency.
Yeah, I love it. This is really the hard work of being a marketer. I've enjoyed the conversation a lot. I wonder if you could tell me something. I mentioned Claire Carlisle at the beginning. You had her on the show recently. That was the episode I listened to right before I came on here. It was like 2 pals getting back together and talking about marketing. It was really outstanding, really, really good. I get asked this a lot. Is there an episode or a handful of episodes that really you think about that really went well that you might want to point our audience to?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, God, there's lots. I'm very fortunate enough to think I'm at 66 or 67. I'm absolutely going to check now. I never thought I'd make it to this point, to be fair. I will say that episode 63, I've lied, I've added 4 episodes on. Episode 63, which depending on when this is released, so episode 63 will be released on the 4th of May. I really, really enjoyed that. I'm not giving away the guests, but the topic is about how content is much more than just SEO blogs. It's somebody who I have hugely admired in the industry, deserves to be a much bigger and more well-known name, who literally blew my mind in terms of what they were sharing. A few times I remember listening to their answers and I was just like, oh wow. But yeah, episode 63, that's about how content is much more than SEO blogs. Typically people like to mention the bigger names in marketing. So 58, Ross Simmons, fantastic episode about getting content distribution right. And I literally said to him, you're on loads of podcasts, but I want you to tell me things that you haven't shared in other podcasts. So I probed him, so there are exclusives on there. Literally there are loads. I would recommend just going through. Please don't listen to them all, it'll be a very long period of time, but I'm quite fortunate enough to cover a wide range of topics in my podcast, all the way through from typical PPC, SEO, social media, to things like pay equity, diversity and inclusion, even in things that I don't know a lot about, like the LGBTQ plus inclusion. Lots of things. Go there, have a look, pick one that you like, and then I always say on my episodes more recently, if you don't want to leave a rating or feedback, just hit up that guest and just say thank you, because it's happened to me in the past. Hopefully it happens after this podcast, where people have said, I've listened to this episode, I've loved it. Do that, it will make somebody stay. So yeah,
awesome. We should probably do this, like if people want to get in touch with you or if they want to find the podcast, where should they go?
Yeah, typically I spend most of my time on social media on Twitter. So I'm on Twitter at Azeem Digital. You can find the podcast, it's called the Azeem Digital Asks podcasts, shameless plug. My website is IamAzeemDigital.com, and hopefully, touch wood, if none of that works, just type in how can I contact Azeem. Depending on this ongoing battle that I'm having with the jewelers in London, I should have the featured snippet there, and you should find my contact page on the website. This is where you do it.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Your neck out there. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I'm really a fan of yours now. I'm glad I got introduced to the podcast, and I'll continue to listen in. I'm going to give you a virtual cheers for now, and for the rest of our audience, we'll be back next week with another episode of Suds Search. Thanks again, Azeem.